What it do, guys? This X Factor 27 coming back to you guys again today. Today we're gonna be reacting to a video about Wrestle with Andy. It's about sad declines of former wrestlers that went downhill pretty much. You expect wrestlers to have a happy ending and just go into the fairy tale land and just be able to do what they can do and stuff like that. But it seems like that's not always the case. So guys, sit back, relax, and watch this video with me. And the link to the original video will be down below. So let's go.
We all like to think that our favorite wrestlers will get a happy ending, and thankfully in many cases this has been exactly what's happened, as over the years the likes of Steve Austin, Shawn Michaels, and Sting, just to name a few, have been able to walk off into retirement with things still going well. Unfortunately though, not every performer gets this. No, some have to go through a sad decline before all is said and done, whether that decline be in real life or in the ring. But just who are the biggest examples of this in wrestling history? Well, that's exactly what we're going to be looking at right now, starting with Jake the Snake Roberts. Yes, we all know that over the course of his career, Jake Roberts had to deal with a lot of personal demons which were sparked by his pretty traumatic childhood. And this meant that even when he was on top of the world, when he was a big star back during the golden era of 80s WWF, he was struggling with addiction. Back then, however, it wasn't as obvious that he had such issues because whenever it was time to go through the curtain and perform, the Gainesville native could channel all his pain into one of the most compelling wrestling characters of all time. Someone who, whether he was wrestling a match or cutting a promo, forced audiences to lean in closer and pay real attention to what he was doing. A vast difference from his peers at the time. But as the 90s came around and his personal issues started to get more and more out of control, even this great on-screen character wasn't enough to stop his life from going off the rails. No, this was the point that Jake lost himself in a spiral of addiction, with his downfall being immortalized in the documentary Beyond the Mat. Thank God things would turn around for him then, as at some point during the early 2010s, Jake would get help from his close friend Diamond Dallas Page. And it was with the help of
Yeah, sorry to pause the video, guys, but DDP Diamond Dallas Page has helped out a lot of people, man. I tell you, because helped out Cody Rhodes, Jake the Snake Roberts, and just with Jake the Snake Roberts' addiction, that's nothing to play with, man. I know, especially during that time, during the 80s and 90s, and even probably still to this day, people still struggle with addiction and all that stuff. So yeah, it's a bad thing, but if you guys are suffering with that, call a hotline, go get some kind of help, because it's nothing to play with for real.
DDP that the Snake would manage to get back on the wagon again, with this being a place he's remained for the most part ever since. That's right, rather than ending his story in tragedy, Jake Roberts has been able to turn things around, with him now even finding regular employment in the wrestling industry again as the current manager of La Faction Ingobernable in All Elite Wrestling. It's just a shame the same thing couldn't happen with our next subject, another person who got a lot of help from DDP, Scott Hall. Now, to say Scott Hall was one of the most underrated wrestlers of his era would be the understatement of the century, as, back during the mid-90s, he was always a highlight of the WWF roster when he was playing the character of Razor Ramon. Sure, he may never have won a world title or anything, but his star power always shone bright. And that was why, when he jumped over to WCW in 1996, it was a big enough deal that sparked what would soon become a game-changing angle for the entire industry in the NWO. Sadly though, by the time the NWO was in full swing, Scott would already be crumbling in his personal life, as his addiction issues did a number on him. And if you need any evidence of this being the case, you only have to look at some of his later appearances on WCW television, perhaps most infamously his Last Call Scott Hall gimmick. Hell, even when he got a second chance with WWE in 2002, the bad guy still couldn't overcome his issues. And this led to his time in the WWE that go-around being shorter than it should have been. But as we alluded to a moment ago, this wasn't the end for him. No, for a good few years before he passed away, he would be able to get his life back on track, mostly through the help of his friend Diamond Dallas Page. Sure,
See, DDP always coming to help, man, I tell you. So shout out to DDP, man. He's been in wrestling for a long time. One of the first people to ever really make the cutter his finisher. So it's good to see that and stuff like that. But from what reports I've seen and just clips and videos like Wrestle with Andy has said, DDP is one of the best people to have in your corner for real. And he kind of helps people get over the edge if they're having problems and stuff. So shout out to DDP.
Would be the occasional bump in the road here and there, but for the most part, Scott was able to keep himself clean throughout the 2010s. Tragically, though, he would pass away in 2022. Yes, it was a sad way for his story to end, but at least there was some solace to be taken in the fact that, after he had passed on, both fans and people working within the industry were quick to rain down love and tributes on him. Yes, Scott Hall will always go down as a legend of wrestling and arguably the greatest to never win a world title. Not that being a former world champion means you won't have a sad decline at the end of your life, though. No, sometimes this is just inevitable, and that was certainly the case for our next subject, Andre the Giant. Of course, in the case of
Yeah, I know. I heard reports that Andre had a lot of demons he was battling and stuff, especially with alcoholism and stuff like that as well, and probably drugs. I don't know, it's either one or the two of them, and Andy's probably gonna explain it more. But yeah, Andre was a big guy, and they say he had a lot of health problems as well, man. But I remember he's one of the first clips I ever seen of wrestling when Hulk Hogan lifted him and did the slam. So yeah, so we're gonna see a lot more about Andre the Giant and what demons and problems he has.
Andre the Giant, it wasn't substance issues which led to his downfall. No, in his case, it was just pure genetics, as with him suffering from gigantism for his entire life, there was never going to be a happy ending here, not unless he got the surgery that ended up greatly extending the life of people like the Big Show. However, Andre's gargantuan size certainly made him a bigger star than he would have been otherwise. After all, how many people back then could walk into any territory they wanted to at any given time and become an instant main eventer? And how many people could become such a household name during the early 80s based on their look alone that they rivaled the likes of Hulk Hogan and Macho Man Randy Savage? That said, this dedication to being as big of a star as possible also had a downside to it, because as his life went on and he hit his 30s, the sheer stress his size was putting on his body meant he started to break down long before his time. And that meant that during those final few years he was an active wrestler, anything post his Hulk Hogan feud, he'd be a shell of the wrestler he once was. Yes, in the space of a few years, Andre went from headlining WrestleMania 3 against the Hulkster to barely being mobile in undercard tag matches. And when even this became too much for him, he'd have to step away from the ring entirely. And sadly, due to the strain his size was putting on his body, it would be in January of 1993 that Andre passed away, with him only being 46 years old at this point, still in many ways a young man. And because he passed on so young, it means we never got a chance to see what he might have done next in life, with this being a truly tragic fact to have to accept. But for as sad as that was, there's an arguably even sadder tale to be found in the decline of our next subjects. And we say subjects because this one encompasses an entire family, the Von Erich family. Yes, if you've seen The Iron Claw, then you'll know all about the Von Erich's tragic history, a truly Shakespearean tale if there ever was one. 6 brothers, one of whom passed away as an infant, and 4 of whom passed away in their 20s or early 30s. That's right, despite Kevin, Kerry, David, Mike, and Chris Von Erich all becoming wrestlers during the mid-80s for their father's territory, and with the power of their magnetic charisma and in-ring skills, making WCCW one of the hottest places in the industry for a while, the whole thing would turn into a horror story when in 1984, at the age of just 25, David passed away while on a tour of Japan. And a mere 3 years later in 1987, Mike Von Erich would also pass on, and this would come at just 23 years old. And then again in 1991, Chris Von Erich, the youngest brother, also met the same fate. Then after this, Kerry Von Erich, someone better known to many fans as former Intercontinental Champion the Texas Tornado, would also tragically pass away in February of 1993 while he was still just 33 years old. So that left only one brother remaining, with Kevin Von Erich having to live the rest of his life without any of his siblings. Sure.
Oh man, I'm sorry to pause the video, guys, but that's freaking crazy, man. So young, God, and being the only one left, and you had your brothers your whole life, and now none of them are around. Dang, I didn't know that. I never watched the Iron Claw. I may have to check that out one day. Would you guys like a review on it? Let me know down below if you guys would. But man, I feel sorry for them for real. So young, that's crazy.
In the years since, Kevin has been able to find some solace in becoming an inspirational tale of someone taking tragedy and turning it into something good. And the reason we say that is because, as things stand today, he lives in a family compound in Texas surrounded by his wife, his children, and his grandchildren. Hell, two of his children, Marshall and Ross Von Erich, have even gone on to become wrestlers themselves. But even if this is the case, it's still hard to think of the Von Erich name and not see it as a sad story, because they had so many terrible things happen to them over the years. But what about our next subject? That being the Dynamite Kid. Yes, this is a man who is one of the most influential wrestlers to ever lace up a pair of boots, someone who pretty much started the modern high-flying style as we know it. But he certainly paid the price for all his athletic efforts over the years, and the price he paid was his body giving out on him by the time he was in his 30s, with this forcing him into a wheelchair. But then, when you were doing the kind of things he was doing in the ring back during his heyday of the 80s, it's perhaps no surprise this was the end result. Of course, it wasn't just the physical aspect which led to Tom Billington's downfall, though. No, there was also the psychological aspect too, because he was not an easy man to get along with. Hell, he could be an outright violent man to both friends and his enemies, and this eventually led to a lot of people cutting him out of their lives completely by the time all was said and done. So because of that, we had a situation where, in one decade, the Dynamite Kid is riding high at the absolute cutting edge of the wrestling world, and in the next, he's living alone in his house in the UK. Truly, this represents a hell of a decline, and one he probably never foresaw back when he was dominating the WWF Tag Team division with Davey Boy Smith, or going out to Japan to change the game for what wrestling could be. But sadly, that's how things ended up going for Tommy Billington. And
Yeah, and just him being one of the foundation for high flying wrestling and stuff. People don't know that them high flying stuff is dangerous and it does put a toll on your body, man. And him doing that during the late 80s and 90s, probably moves that weren't probably as safe, is probably banned now as well too. I can understand why he got to the point he was at, but him being in a wheelchair and not having no support system, mainly because of himself and the mental problems and instabilities and stuff, that's a hard pill, man. So I hate that for him.
when he passed away on his 60th birthday in December of 2018, fans were quick to recognize his legacy and what he did for the wrestling industry as a whole. And as it happened, Tom Billington isn't the only trailblazer of the wrestling industry who ended up having a dramatic downfall and passing on before their time, as the same thing happened with our next subject, Chyna. Chyna. A true game changer for women's wrestling.
Triple H's first major girl before he met Stephanie and started dating her and became the overcreative now. So yeah, if you guys didn't know, Triple H and Chyna used to have a thing going on back in the day, man. Till Stephanie took Triple H from Chyna and stuff, and Chyna had her own problems as well. I think she was the only woman to win the Intercontinental Championship or something like that. I could be wrong. If I'm wrong, let me know down below, guys. But yeah, I remember her. I wasn't born during this time, and I think during the late day, I was like 4 or 5 years old. But I remember her a lot, especially with her time in DX and stuff. So with Shawn Michaels and Triple H. So
if there ever was one. And the reason Joanie Laurer became so highly regarded was because back during the late 90s, she was an absolute phenomenon. Someone who quickly outgrew the limitations of being a women's wrestler and who went on to become one of the most recognizable acts of the Attitude Era. Hell, so much did she break through during this time, she'd become the first and to date only woman to ever win the Intercontinental title. Sadly though, by the time 2001 came around and a new millennium was dawning, things would begin to falter for the ninth wonder of the world. How did this happen? Well, after leaving WWF in 2001 due to several issues behind the scenes, she was out of a job. And things started to spiral for Chyna here, as she fell into a pit of addiction. Not that this would overwhelm her completely right away, though. No, she'd continue to work for a little while by popping up in places like New Japan. But once that was over and the wrestling opportunities dried up, she'd find herself having to look toward other avenues which included starring in adult films. Yes, after a tape of her leaked online, Chyna decided to get into the adult industry, and that's what led to films like One Night in China being produced. And this would all end up in tragedy, as in April of 2016, at just 46 years old, she would pass away at too young of an age. Honestly, if we were to rank these stories in terms of how sad they are, then this one would be pretty high up in the list, as it didn't have to be this way for someone who was such an icon to so many back at the turn of the millennium. But sometimes having that level of adoration isn't enough to stop someone from losing themselves, and it appears this is exactly what happened with China. But what of another notable women's star of that era? Someone who was less known for her time in the ring and more for her charisma on the mic. Well, she's our next subject as it happens, because when it comes to Sunny, her decline was also a dramatic one. Yes, cast your mind back to 1995. That was the point, Tim.
Yeah, just before I was born, guys. So we're gonna both be learning something new here. So
Lynn Sitch first joined WWF and was given the new name of Sunny. And the reason she was given this name was because, aside from her sunny disposition, she was going to serve as the manager for her real-life boyfriend, Skip, better known to most as Chris Candido. But managing Skip wouldn't be the only thing Sunny did while in WWF. No, her talents quickly became apparent, and so it wasn't long before she was doing other things too, like handling backstage segments, in-ring interviews, and even spells on the commentary booth. Obviously then, this exposure, combined with her good looks, made her a star, particularly amongst the young male fan base of the time. Such a star would she become, in fact, at one point she was the most downloaded woman on AOL back during the early days of the internet. So where...
Lord, not AOL. Lord. Dang. I remember AOL when I was like 10 or 11 years old, hearing about it. It's amazing how far we have come, guys. This is freaking crazy. AOL dial-up. Jesus.
Did the problems begin for her then? Well, like with so many others we've looked at today, Tammy fell into addiction, and this would cause her numerous problems in her personal life as the years went on, as well as make her several enemies backstage. Of course, that's not the only reason she made enemies backstage though. No, there were also constant rumors of attitude problems on her part, and when she started having a rumored affair with Shawn Michaels during the latter half of the decade, this caused even more people to turn on her, particularly those who were loyal to Chris Candido. So it was then that when she was finally cut from her WWF contract in 1998, there weren't many clamoring for her to come back, and this lack of an option to return to the company led her and Chris to go further down the pit of addiction. Where would this end for them? Well, in 2005, Chris Candido would pass away. And now, without her support network, Sunny would spiral further, as for the next 2 decades, every time you heard her name in the news, it was followed by a disastrous story. And all this reached its peak when in 2022, she was sentenced to 17.5 years in prison. But not all sad stories have a sad ending. No, some can end on a more positive note, as is the case with our next subject.
What did she do to go to jail 17 years? That's freaking crazy, man. Wow. And that I do remember her and her rumored affair with Shawn Michaels and stuff. Shawn Michaels was another person that also had a lot of problems and stuff, but Triple H and them actually helped him out, get him straight. It took a lot, but they got him straight. But I know he's about to talk about Jeff Hardy. I'm gonna talk about him since he's already popped up. Jeff Hardy, man, one of my favorite wrestlers growing up. He had a lot of problems too with addiction and stuff. I know he recently tweeted and said if he wouldn't have his problems and demons and stuff, he wouldn't have been as big as John Cena. I don't know about all that, but he could have been top 3, not all time, but popular among kids. Because when you go back to Jeff Hardy during his heyday, especially during his singles run, when he had the armbands and all that stuff, when he won the WWE Championship, the World Heavyweight Championship, for CM Punk cashed in. Oh man, I remember that feud. It was craziness, and he was so popular. And armbands would sell out like that. I used to have a few when I was younger, so yeah. So I know Andy's about to talk about Jeff Hardy now, and his stint in TNA was good, but that debacle he had with Sting and he came high as a kite and just ruined Slammiversary main event like that. I just hate it because it made Jeff look so bad, and Jeff seems like such a good person and stuff like that. So everybody has their demons, but it seems like he's kind of working it better now, and he kind of got control of it. So
Jeff Hardy. Yes, Jeff Hardy, the man who, if things had worked out just a little differently, would be on top of the wrestling world today as one of its greatest legends. After all, this is a man who completely captured the hearts of alternative kids everywhere during the late 90s and early 2000s, and who influenced an entire generation to lace up their boots for the first time. Seriously, so popular was this guy, at one point his merchandise was outselling John Cena's. And that led to WWE finally deciding to pull the trigger on him as world champion in a singles capacity in 2008 after years of him being a tag team specialist. Unfortunately though, not long after that trigger was pulled, it became apparent WWE had made a mistake as they remembered why it had taken them so long to make such a move in the first place, with the reason for this being that Jeff had his own personal issues with addiction. Understandably then, the two sides would part ways not long after this, and that would lead to Jeff finding work over in TNA instead. And while TNA had no such qualms about pushing their newest signing to the moon at first, they soon learned the hard way too, that asking him to stay clean at this time was a tall order. Just go back and watch the infamous match with Sting at Victory Road 2011, where he comes down to the ring in no condition to perform, leading to the company having to call a quick audible and get things wrapped up urgently before someone could get hurt. And that's the way things would continue for Jeff in the years following too, with him getting multiple chances in just about every company under the sun, with him continually struggling to battle with his personal demons. And that's made all the more tragic when you consider just how big he's been when he's been at his peak. Seriously, this is someone who, if things were just a little different, would probably be thought about in the same breath as a Shawn Michaels or a John Cena. Fortunately, though, it seems like Jeff has finally managed to clean his life up and is on the straight and narrow. And we hope this all leads to him and his brother one day returning to WWE for one final run and a Hall of Fame induction. Because even if things haven't always worked out for him the way they were planned, he's still, without a doubt, one of the greatest talents we've ever seen. But what about the sad downfall of our next subject? That being Magnum TA. That's right, we're going back to the territory days as...
I have no idea who this is, so we're gonna learn some more about Magnum TA too. So sadly, probably bad, but more knowledge for us.
As it's there in the mid-80s that we find Magnum TA, the man who at one point looked all set to be the next big breakout babyface of Jim Crockett Promotions. And this was someone JCP desperately needed, as with WWF starting their own golden era on the other channel and them booming in popularity as a result, the gap between the two sides was starting to widen significantly. Of course, with Magnum TA being the perfect guy to appeal to the audience, the hope was this gap would be closed again before long. And that's exactly what led to the Virginian quickly rising up the ranks over the next couple of years as he won the NWA United States Heavyweight Championship on 2 separate occasions. And it wasn't just holding the gold which was raising his stock back then. No, it was also the matches he was having while doing so. After all, who can forget about that steel cage match Magnum had against Tully Blanchard at Starrcade 1985? To this day, probably still the greatest cage match we've ever seen. Really, after a certain point, it was just a matter of waiting for him to finally challenge Ric Flair for the NWA World's title and win it, with this fully solidifying him as the guy to lead the charge against Vince McMahon and Hulk Hogan. Tragically though, before that could happen, Magnum TA's career would be cut short when he was involved in a car accident on October 14th, 1986, which left him with a broken back. Yes, right before he could reach the mountaintop, the rug would be pulled out from under the Virginian. And in the process, the rug would be pulled out from JCP too, as it wouldn't be until the rise of Sting a few years later that they finally found that next top babyface. Would Magnum ever wrestle again following this? Unfortunately, no. His back would be too damaged for that. And so, just as quickly as it started, the saga of Magnum TA came to an end, and we were all left to wonder what might have been had that accident not occurred. Would Jim Crockett have risen to the level of being able to seriously challenge 80s WWF? Maybe. Who knows? They might have even beaten them. And that would have left a very different landscape for people like our next subject during the 90s, someone who also had a...
Dang, man, I hate that about his back, though. Right when you're about to reach the mountaintop, you fall off. Well, at least the thing about it, at least he didn't pass away in a car accident. I know that's hopefully not making things better, but he was alive and he was able to still walk and stuff. It's just, back is a very sensitive part of your body. And if it's not working good, it's not working good for real. So,
dramatic downfall, someone who goes by the name of Perry Saturn. Now, when it comes to Perry Saturn, he was unlikely to make it all the way to the world title. No, he was more of a guy you might refer to as a solid hand or even a wrestler's wrestler, and that's not to diminish him, of course. No, people like that are very important in the world of wrestling, and over the course of his career, Perry certainly filled this role well. It doesn't matter if he was working in ECW, WCW, WWF, or anywhere else. He always delivered on what he was asked to do, and this made him a valuable addition to any promoter's roster of talent. Where does this downfall come into play with him then? Well, that happened in the mid-2000s when, after the wrestling work began to dry up, Perry found himself going through a difficult spell. And it was during this spell that, like many wrestlers before him, he would sadly fall into addiction. And things would get out of control for Perry because he'd end up homeless. And it's at this point he disappeared off the radar completely for several years, with even some of his closest friends being unsure as to where he was. Thankfully, however, in 2010 he would show up once more, at this point revealing that he had gotten himself cleaned up and was ready to start rebuilding his life. We can only hope that we hear more positive endings for other wrestlers that have had a tough time of it, because as we've seen today, wrestling can be a tough business to be in.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that's the end of the video. Shout out to Wrestle with Andy as always. Link to the original video will be down below. Man, it's just the fact that addiction is something serious, and being on the road, dealing with all this stuff like that, and wrestling totally takes on your body, the mental and physical. It's a lot, man. So what do you guys think about this video? Like, comment, subscribe if you guys want to, and y'all have a good day. X Factor out.